You wake up at 3 a.m., you're covered in sweat, and you're racked with a nameless dread again. You start adding up all the strange things that have been happening to you lately, and suddenly you realize, oh God, this is it. I'm in the club. Surprise! Welcome to Menopause. It's a secret society with 1 billion members worldwide, and it's not just women. There are non-binary folks in the club. Trans guys get a version of it, and trans women if they go off estrogen, and even plain old garden variety men if you get treated for prostate cancer. One, I hope you're okay, but if they use estrogen, you're probably gonna get a taste of this too. So I'm just going to define my terms so you know what I'm talking about, or more specifically, complaining about. Most of what I'm going to be talking about tonight deals with perimenopause, which is the period before and around menopause. Menopause, like capital big M menopause, is a year after your last period. Post-menopause, you're done. You still have to go to the OBGYN if you have that equipment. You want to get that system checked. But menopause generally is the umbrella term. So that's what we're talking about. And if you're wondering if you're in the club, almost half of women report that perimenopause was a surprise to them. They didn't know it was a thing. This guy. So here are some things to look out for if there is a uterus in your life. And if you're reading this and you're going, oh, shit, then the good news is you don't need treatment. It's a normal thing that happens to half the world. The bad news is it may be rough. And you may want it to go away, and there is treatment available, so, you know, that's good. But some of us have the training that you're not supposed to talk about this in front of guys. And so those of you who've never had a uterus or ovaries might never have been invited to this conversation. And that's not really fair because there's 1 billion people going through it right now and you haven't been given a chance to understand it. So, welcome. Here's your sneak peek. It's gonna be so much fun. So just so you have an idea what folks have been putting up with, I'm gonna try to do a history of menopause in Western medicine in about 3 minutes. It's gonna go super well, no problem. It is such a fun history. So the 3 basic messages have been, 1, something's wrong with you. 2, it's probably your fault. And 3, you are now useless to society. Yay! So for a very long time, starting with Galen in Rome, it was believed that menstruation was, well, terrifying, but healthy. And when it stopped, that was bad. So from the trotula in 13th century Italy to 16th century England, the cures all kind of amounted to the same thing. Bloodletting. It's always a crowd pleaser. It's been popular for centuries. I mean, the blood's got to come from somewhere, right? And then in the 19th century, cutting organs out sounded like a good idea to somebody, so we're looking at removing ovaries, we're looking at genital mutilation, and we're looking at hysterectomies, all before the advent of surgical hygiene. Whee! But of course, you have to remember that menopause is probably your fault, mostly because you like sex or you get annoyed about things. So by the Victorian era, you're looking at cures like opium enemas and being locked up in asylums. So Dr. Kellogg, you know the guy who invented cornflakes to keep people from masturbating? That guy? He was particularly slut-shaming about it and specifically claimed that having an abortion meant that you would get cancer during menopause. What a guy. Fortunately, the Victorian era was also when women started being admitted to medical school. So for the first time, they start addressing each other publicly about their health. Dr. Anna Longshore Potts graduated med school in 1852. That's real early, y'all. And she traveled the world giving lectures to women about their health. She wrote this book, Discourses to Women on Medical Subjects, as a sort of owner's manual for folks in female bodies, since no one else had done that yet. Her take on menopause was this crazy idea that after bearing 8 or 12 or 15 children, it might be nice to have a rest and have people be nice to you for a change. And Dr. Emma Angell Drake, she was elected to the Idaho legislature before women had a constitutional right to vote. So she helped pass the 19th Amendment. She was also a doctor, and she wrote What a Woman of 45 Ought to Know, specifically about menopause, like what you might run into, how you're gonna deal with it, and she urged women to, quote, do and dare great things in the remainder of life. And there's great chapter headings like, do not surrender, and laying down the sword, taking up the pen. She was great. But despite advances in women's education, treatment for menopause was still thin on the ground, and snake oil kind of stepped in to fill the gap. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was advertised as a sure cure without the knife. So, it was not actually harmful. They still sell it today. It contained herbs known to help with menopause, and even more helpfully, it was 20% alcohol. So Lydia Pinkham was an abolitionist Quaker who mixed and sold her own cure-all recipe to support her family after her husband's finances went south. Her own face was printed on the box, and her genius was in marketing directly to women. So she would collect and print testimonials in the newspapers from patients or, customers who had taken her tonic, and they would describe the symptoms that it had helped them cure. And hearing about other women's shared experiences probably made a lot of people feel less alone when they didn't have anyone else to talk about it. But it really upset a lot of guys who wrote nasty letters to the newspapers about it. But even men liked Lydia Pinkham's tonic because it was 40 proof in a time when booze was sometimes hard to come by. And by World War I, the Canadian soldiers were singing this drinking song about it in the trenches, about all of the really disgusting things it might help you cure. It's a really filthy song. No. Maybe later. Getting into the 20th century, menopause was increasingly medicalized as a problem to be solved with drugs. So women were prescribed Thorazine, which is more usually prescribed for schizophrenia, and benzos like Valium, also known as mother's little helpers. Synthetic estrogen was developed in the 1940s, and at that point, menopause started being marketed as a terrible estrogen deficiency that needed to be treated, lest the person suffering it become a horrible burden to the people around her. Premarin was the hot estrogen drug in the 1960s, and it was, and still is, derived from pregnant horse urine, which gave it its catchy name, pregnant mare urine, Premarin. By the 80s and 90s, it was the most prescribed drug in the US. And this was due in large part to this god-awful book in the late 60s called Feminine Forever, which warned that without taking estrogen, quote, no woman can be sure of escaping the horror of this living decay. There was another terrible book at the time that stated, quote, having outlived their ovaries women having outlived their ovaries have outlived their usefulness as human beings. So if you're wondering why we don't talk about menopause, it's because of this stuff. Would you talk about it if this was the history that you were up against? So a lot of our culture's responses to menopause are still disgust or ridicule or dismissal, and it's really not that fun to admit being in it. But you gotta love the 70s. There were all these badass ladies. In 1973, Our Bodies, Ourselves included a very positive, normalizing chapter on menopause, even though none of the authors were old enough to have gone through it yet. And Rosetta Wright is cool as hell. When she started going through menopause, there were literally no books saying that it was an okay, normal thing for someone to go through. So she interviewed 1,000 women about their experiences with it and published Menopause, A Positive Approach. Science! So that's some of the history, and you may be thinking to yourself, that's a really nice talk. I haven't listened to any of it because I've been adding up my medical history for the last 3 years, and I think I might be in perimenopause, so what am I in for? Well, the bad news is no one seems to know. Definitely not me, and probably you, and possibly even your doctor, because less than 60% of medical schools have mandatory menopause training even now, and fewer than 30% of OBGYN programs do. Yeah. If you want to know how long it was going to last, I really can't help you, because there don't seem to be any good numbers, and it's possibly because everybody is different, and part of that is because folks with suddenly triggered menopause from chemo or hysterectomy or starting T may have a really different ride. I don't even know. I don't even know what you're going to go through. I'm new here myself, but it sounds like everything's going to be terrible. Apparently, you're going to know what's going to happen to you when it happens. The good news is, It almost certainly won't be everything on this list. The bad news is it seems to vary tremendously by person, so your mileage may vary. The other good news is it doesn't last forever. This is a tiny, tiny fraction of the people that have gone through this and gotten through it before us, and they all lived pretty cool lives in their later years. So if this is going to be part of your life or someone that you love's life, you might need to take charge of your own care to a certain extent. So find your people and do your research and get support from whoever is good for you. You've got this. And now, I would like to raise a glass to the billions of people who've gone down this road and come out the other side, and in the hopes that the people next to come to this will have an easier time of it. Over and out. Oh.